News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin once again in China. The will of the people has been thwarted by the will of the people's government. It was late at night in Beijing, this morning our time, when a divided leadership of the Communist Party finally decided it had had enough. The anarchy in Beijing, it said, would have to end. And so the leader of the party, who's opposed to force, was moved aside, and additional troops from the People's Army were ordered to move into the city. But before the troops even got close to Tiananmen Square, the enormous crowds were out in the streets again, blocking their way. Our first report on this astonishing day is from John Lawrence.
The People's Army came face to face with the Chinese people and was stopped in its tracks. This convoy of 17 trucks filled with soldiers got as close as 3 miles to Tiananmen Square and could go no farther. Thousands of demonstrators blocked the streets with their bodies. The protesters sang patriotic songs and chanted slogans for freedom and democracy. The People's Army is for the people, they cried. You are one of us. Some of the demonstrators offered the soldiers water, but it was refused. The commanding officer was outnumbered and surrounded. There was nothing in military doctrine for a situation like this. So his men sat and waited for further orders. It was a tactical victory for the demonstrators, not over the soldiers, but the government that ordered them to move in.
I think crackdown is political suicide for the government.
At another point, northeast of the square, a human chain blocked the way of another army convoy. Here, too, it was a standoff. A bus blocked the route on a third street leading to the square, as barricades began to appear on the major roads. This woman begged a soldier to consider the hunger-striking students. They've been fasting there for 7 days, she said. You should not harm them. We are all Chinese. At least one of the soldiers was sympathetic, saying, the student movement is positive. As the hours passed, the soldiers became more relaxed. There were discussions. Some soldiers said they were only told their unit was going to Beijing for military exercises. Some of them started to settle in for what remained of the night. It is early morning here in the square, and the thousands of people who are gathered here are waiting to see and to take part in what happens next. The government's decision to send in the troops has increased the determination of the demonstrators significantly. The students and their supporters were surprised and angered as they listened to a taped speech by Premier Li Peng that was also shown on television. He warned, the capital is in a critical situation. The anarchic state is going from bad to worse. Li Peng declared, we are forced to take resolute and decisive measures to put an end to the turmoil. The reaction was rebellious. Thousands of people poured into the square to continue the protest. One of the student leaders said the hunger strike would now continue, blaming Li Peng and the government. Many of the hunger strikers had agreed to call off their fast, but reversed their decision after listening to Li Peng. The situation at the emergency medical station in the square was becoming critical. The conditions of some students was causing serious concern among the medical staff. And as the mass hunger strike and demonstrations of support went into their 8th day, both sides in the conflict were escalating their actions. John Lawrence, ABC News, Tiananmen Square, Beijing.
There has been speculation all week that one thing preventing the government from cracking down sooner was the presence of Mikhail Gorbachev and the occasion of the Chinese-Soviet summit. Listening to party officials today, they were clearly angry that the students had upset the Gorbachev visit. Gorbachev left China yesterday. Today, the threat that the crackdown was coming. ABC's Todd Carroll is in Beijing.
China's people saw government policy change before their eyes on television today. On the news at noon, the official most sympathetic to the students, Communist Party leader Zhao Ziyang, made an emotional appeal to those at Tiananmen Square to go home. At the end of his talk, viewers nationwide could see students seeking his autograph. On the evening news, the tone was harsher, with Premier Li Peng warning the hunger strikers and their supporters to go home. The television news, which had carried remarkably candid reports on the demonstrations, was reverting to the party line. Later, in a special broadcast after midnight, Li Peng delivered an angry speech, blaming the protests on a small group of conspirators and calling for a restoration of order. He said the Communist Party runs this country and its leadership must be protected. China then heard from Yang Shangkun, its ceremonial president and military leader, who declared the capital was in a state of anarchy and troops would be sent in. It was Yang who said he was humiliated again and again by the protests. On Monday, he was forced to greet Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev at the airport instead of the normal site in front of the Great Hall of the People. Then, Gorbachev's wreath-laying ceremony at the square was canceled, and Yang even complained that tonight he had to be driven an hour and a half out of his way just to reach his meeting. He and Li Peng painted themselves as protectors of 84-year-old Deng Xiaoping, a main target of the demonstrations. During tonight's announcement, Zhao Ziyang was not among the stern group of party leaders, a signal that he has been sidelined, presumably for being too conciliatory to the protesters. The last time a party leader was forced out, it was for exactly the same reasons. And it was that man, Hu Yaobang, whose death last month sparked the protests that have snowballed into a broad-based revolt for democracy and political change. Todd Carroll, ABC News, Beijing.
And so, once again, in Tiananmen Square, a giant standoff. In just a moment, we'll talk to one of the student marshals and see what he thinks is going to happen. Students involved in these demonstrations, we have a chance now to talk to one of them. Zhang Hua is one of the marshals who has been keeping the demonstrations in Tiananmen Square under control. He joins us live now from Beijing. He's an English major. Mr. Zhang, we've been listening to the communist leaders today saying they want an end to this demonstration. Can they stop it?
No, I'm afraid they can't stop this. If they don't accept the demands raised by the students will go on indefinitely until the government accepts the demands.
Do you believe that the army will come to Tiananmen Square?
Yes, I think so, because this time it seems to me that the government has made up its mind to crack down the demonstration.
If the army comes, I beg your pardon, if the army comes, will you fight them?
When I was passing a place on the outskirts, I saw many trucks of soldiers, but they were surrounded by a lot of people, and they just couldn't get into the center of the city. And I hear that in other places of the city, the same thing happened. So it would be a little bit difficult for them to get into the city. But I think in the end, if they use force, they will get into the city.
And as a marshal for the students, what are your instructions?
Well, my task is to make sure that the hunger strikers are set apart from those outsiders and to make sure that they are safe. That's my duty.
Now, the hunger strike stopped, and now it has started again, and I believe you want it to grow. Am I correct?
Yeah.
To grow in which way?
If I had time, I'll go back and be a marshal again. That's my duty, because my classmates were there on hunger strike. That's my responsibility to join them. I'm part of them.
You told me a little earlier, when we were waiting to go on the air, that you thought there would be 200,000 hunger strikers now. Do you really think that's possible?
That's possible. I think maybe more than that. As soon as the students in the universities hear of the news, they are sure to come. And I really don't know how many of them would come. I'm sure over 500,000. That's possible. Because everybody's angry with what the government is doing.
Well, Mr. Zhang, I thank you for taking time away from your duties to come and talk to us. Zhang Hua in our bureau in Beijing, and Tiananmen Square is filling up again even as we were talking. And now the U.S. and China. President Bush said today that the demonstrations in China show a relentless desire for freedom in the communist world. The president said he never would have imagined such events were possible when he served as the U.S. ambassador to China in the early 1970s. Like the rest of us, the Bush administration is trying to figure out precisely what is going on. Here's ABC's John McWethy.
As it has every day this week, the State Department warned the government in Beijing that it must exercise restraint in dealing with the demonstrators.
Our views are very well known. I've spoken about it, but more important than that, the president has said these things over the past few weeks.
In reality, the U.S. may not have much leverage, but it has a growing interest in a China that has been increasingly open. Last year, for example, the U.S. and China did $13 billion in trade, and there are more U.S.-Chinese joint ventures opening every week. 40,000 Chinese students are now going to school in the United States, and last month, for the first time, a Chinese warship visited a U.S. port. Even with the kind of turmoil in Beijing this week, analysts say these kinds of ties will probably continue to grow. In the short term, American policymakers are advising U.S. businesses that operate in China to simply hang on until the United States and the rest of the world have a clearer picture of what direction the Chinese government will now go. John McWethy, ABC News, the State Department.
One other note here at the end of our broadcast tonight, we'll be joined by 3 of America's leading China hands, and we'll try to find out what